On behalf of my colleagues at the World Bank, my colleague Paulo Sotero, the director of the Brazil Institute, it's a pleasure to welcome you to this lunch discussion of the Rio +20 United Nations Conference on Sustainable Development. As the title of the conference suggests, it's been 20 years since the last United Nations Conference on Sustainable Development in Rio de Janeiro. Since that time, Latin America has served as somewhat of a laboratory for the whole world in terms of examples of green and inclusive growth. For example, the region has the lowest carbon energy matrix of the developing world, experiences in upgrading slums based on community-driven processes, and the world's most extensive use of bus rapid transit. Anyone who's visited Bogota can talk about the Transmilenio, which I'm sure Eddie, as a native Colombian, knows much about. The study that we will be discussing today by the World Bank suggests that Latin America has become a region of a solutions provider through many innovations that are clean, efficient, resilient, and socially inclusive. Joining us for today's discussion are three distinguished authors and analysts that have had a wealth of experience in the field of green development. The author of the World Bank report, Ede Ijas Vasquez, is the sector manager of Sustainable Development Unit for China and Mongolia at the World Bank. Throughout his career at the bank, he has served in Latin America, in Russia, in Central Asia, and the Caucasus, and has managed water and sanitation programs, energy, and corporate environment strategies for implementation. He has a PhD and a Master of Science from Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Civil and Environmental Engineering. He will make the main presentation today of the World Bank's report. We couldn't have two more qualified commentators on the report who will not only offer their reflections on what the World Bank has produced, but also can speak independently from their own body of expertise. Carlos Manuel Rodriguez, to my right, is the former Vice Minister and Minister of Environment and Energy from Costa Rica. He is now the Vice President of International Policy of Conservation International. He directs Conservation International's Mexico and Central America program and is taking the many experiences with innovation that Costa Rica has modeled and pioneered for the entire world and expanding those through Mexico and the Central American region. Ambassador Alec Watson is the managing director of Hills & Company, international consulting firm here in the United States. Alec had a 30-year-plus distinguished career in the U.S. Foreign Service, serving most recently during the first Clinton administration as Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere Affairs. I think I first met Alec when he was ambassador to Peru in the mid-1980s, a much more difficult time well, Peru still is having difficult times. He was also Deputy Chief of Mission in Brasilia, in Bogota, and in La Paz, Bolivia. Among these qualifications in the U.S. Foreign Service, after he retired from the Foreign Service, he served as Vice President and Executive Director for International Conservation of the Nature Conservancy. And I will add that the one part of Alec's bio that's not part of his formal advertisement, he is also a board member of the Latin American program here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Before beginning, I'd be remiss if I didn't thank a number of people who were critical to putting this event together. My colleagues from the World Bank, Marcela Sanchez, don't escape yet, Ana Luna Barros, both who were very instrumental in preparing this meeting, Michael Darden from Program Assistant with the Brazil Institute, Veronica Colon Rosario of the Latin American program, as well as a number of interns, and I would like to thank them all at this time. Ede will make opening remarks of approximately 25 minutes, followed by comments, and then we will open it for discussion. If it becomes too hot in here and you are about to expire, please help yourself to one of the remaining cans of soda or water. Without further ado, Eddie.
Absolutely. Okay. So now let me try to get this out because I prefer to to talk standing, and that helps me to deliver the message. First of all, big thanks to all of you for being with us today. And how this is different from other presentations and how we want to make this event today is that instead of the World Bank coming here and saying we're launching this big report, in reality this is a process of conversation, right? We are all in the process of going to Rio+20, and there has been a lot of conversation in different circles about what does it mean green growth. I joined the Latin America region in the World Bank about 6 months ago. So I have to be close to the light so that I can. Good. Works? Wonderful. Okay, so I joined about 6 months ago in the Latin American region. My last 4 years were in the World Bank office in Beijing, handling the Sustainable Development Program in the World Bank there. And when I arrived, there was a lot of conversation about, green growth. And so we start asking, what does that mean? And at our central policy department, our chief economist for the Sustainable Development Network was at the same time trying to figure out what does all this mean, these terms in practical ways, green growth, right? And then out of all that conversation, then the term began to evolve into green and inclusive growth. And what you have in front of you are 2 reports that are just coming out, one at the global level, trying to figure out definitions, analysis, summaries of the best research on green and inclusive growth. And then at the Latin America region, we began to say, you know what? There are so many interesting examples around in Latin America that has been really like an incubator of these kind of ideas that actually match some of these concepts. And the report there is trying to say for Latin America, what does it mean in practical terms at the sector level, at the program level, green and inclusive growth? And what are some of the practical experiences that we are seeing in these countries that truly reflect well that concept? So the conversation today is trying to walk around those issues. And first thing, disclaimer, we don't have the right answer. And part of this is an opportunity to have a conversation with many of you in this process. And I'm so pleased to have Carlos Manuel and Alexander here as part of the thinking process to help us in that direction. So let me start by telling you, we'll talk a little bit about the relationship as we see between the concept of sustainable development and green growth, trying to zoom it in, what does it mean, for example, green growth in urban development, and what do we see in Latin America so far. A couple of examples on inclusive green growth in practice, and then finally some of the challenges, which I think are tremendous moving forward. But as you start peeling away the concept of green and inclusive growth, then you figure out options in that direction. So since Rio, actually, as Cynthia was saying, Latin America has really been an incubator of ideas into this process, all the way having a low energy carbon matrix, the first regional catastrophic risk insurance facility in the Caribbean to deal with adaptation to climate change, from the payments of environmental services and the whole program in Costa Rica and in Mexico to the frontiers of sustainable cattle ranching in Brazil and Colombia, from community-driven slum upgrading to the world's most extensive use of bus rapid transit systems. Many examples out there, and part of the process is to try to extract some of the lessons and the common themes that cut across all these sectors, and to put it in as part of the conversation on the road to Rio+20. So, green growth, what everybody starts saying, and then some of the definition that my colleagues put on the table is that, look, green growth in the end is economic growth that is environmentally sustainable. So I read this, it's like, so, sure, we need that. We knew that a long time ago. What is different into this process? And the reality and part of the conversation is that it may not be a new paradigm, but it's a practical way to go about it. And here's when I have these conversations, when I realize that words matter a lot. When I talk about sustainable development, the natural reaction tends to be, yes, this is something that we need to do 15, 20 years from now. This is for the next generation or 2 generations down the road. But when you talk about growth, and when you start seeing the rapid rates of growth in Latin America over the last 10 years and that are expected to continue, then it is not something that you can wait. The choices that are made today with those rapid rates of growth will determine and will lock you in center patterns that are difficult to change. For some sectors, you may be able to change a road in the next 10 to 15 years after you used it. For a power plant, you may be able to change in 30 to 40 years of infrastructure. For an urban city, the shape of the city you basically cannot do anything about it. And therefore, if you are growing so fast, the decisions that you make today lock you in very important patterns that are either sustainable or unsustainable. Okay? Now, basically, and the second point that I want to drive here is that not everything that you do that is green is necessarily inclusive. And the practical example that I do when I sit down with mayors is saying, look, as a mayor, you have so much budget and you're interested in saying, why don't we reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases out of our urban transport in the city? And as a mayor, you have, as policy choices, many choices. You can give a subsidy so you can have more hybrid cars in your fleet, and therefore you reduce the emissions out of that, and you have so much money, and therefore that's how you reduce it. But who's going to be able to benefit out of that process? Those who are able to buy the hybrid cars. And therefore, it's not necessarily the poorest segments of the population. On the other hand, basically, you can use the same amount of money and move into a good, clean, efficient, and affordable public transport system that serves the poor also. And therefore, you may also be able to reduce the same level of greenhouse gas emissions, but at the same time, you are serving the poor. And therefore, that balance between green and inclusive becomes a very important part of the conversation as we begin to see, and some of the cases move in different Latin American countries. And Brazil has been in the dialogue, as many of you know, very strong about saying, look, it's a balance. It's not only green growth. In reality, it's green and inclusive growth, right? You can't go between green and growth without basically working with people. So it's green and inclusive. Okay, so the second question that I asked my team is that, okay, I'm a simple engineer. I'm not a sophisticated economist like many of my colleagues in the bank. Explain to me in very simple words that what does it mean, green growth? And basically, as you start trying to put it in simple terms, there are three words that have begun to emerge, okay? Green growth is a growth that is clean, basically, where you're trying to reduce the pollutants and the pollution emitting, both local and global, into that perspective. It is a growth that is efficient, and we are trying to drive with this the message that efficiency in the choices that are made is very important, okay? And therefore, a lot of these problems basically need to deal with issues of energy efficiency, of water efficiency, of agricultural production efficiency, as inherent part of the process. Because you can have a growth that is clean, but can be very inefficient, right? You can have a growth that basically comes and treats all the wastewater very well, but if you are wasting a tremendous amount of water and being very inefficient about it, that's not necessarily green. So we're trying to use simple words to try to see what does it mean in practical terms, this idea of green growth. And something that emerged basically over the last 10, 15 years has been the dimension that green growth is a growth that is also resilient. Resilient, what does it mean? Resilient in terms of a growth that is better prepared for the natural disasters of today, okay? And also realizes that with the changing climate, then there's going to be different frequency and intensity of those natural disasters, or the floods and the droughts, for example. But the process is that if you are not ready, and again, it's the same question. People talk about adaptation to climate change as something that, yes, we'll get to that. Once the climate change, we adapt. And part of the argument is that countries that are better prepared for the disasters of today will necessarily be better prepared for the disasters of tomorrow, no matter in which direction they go. Readiness and resilience of this growth today, and again, is the urgency of incorporating that dimension into the decisions made out of this rapid growth path that determine whether you lock your growth into situations and patterns that are more or less resilient vis-a-vis climate change in the future. And again, driving the word that has to be inclusive. So, clean, efficient, resilient, inclusive, okay? But look, I mean, we don't have the answers. What does that mean for policy making? What does it mean when you are trying to define investment programs? What does it mean when you're trying to choose among trade-offs? And basically, there's a whole bunch of questions that we don't know, and the report tries to go a little bit into that process. A whole research agenda moving forward to try to determine basically what we know and what it is that we don't know. All right, so what the report tries to do is to say, okay, so if this is more or less what we are beginning to see in terms of peeling away the onion of the concept of green and inclusive growth, what does it mean in practical terms, and what are some of the experiences in the water and sanitation sector? What does it mean in the urban sector? What does it mean in the agricultural sector? What does it mean in natural resources management? And the report is organized in that way to try to say, okay, let's go and let's look at what are the challenges. Let's try to look at what does it mean greener growth trajectories that are cleaner, more efficient, that are more resilient in very specific situations, and what are some of the practical examples moving forward. So to try to walk you through one of the examples, we're going to be talking about urban, all right? So everybody says, look, Latin America, a very urbanized region, so the problem is done. Actually, everybody has migrated. Not true. Next 10 years, we're going to have 60 million more people in cities, all right? And the problem is that actually the growth in the urban areas is going to be even more than the overall urban population growth for the region. It's a region that continues to be urbanizing, all right? And this is a graph that we try to use to explain the concept of urban shape. Okay, so what you have here, on the bottom corner, Barcelona, on the top corner, Atlanta. 2.5 million people, all right? And they're at the same scale, all right? So the concept of sprawl cannot be more graphically illustrative than that, right? Now, the point is that the shape of Paris and London today was the shape that they had 200-300 years ago. So you may be able to change roads, locations. You may be able to change power plant decisions after 30, 40 years of work. But once a city grows like this, there's no way you can change Atlanta, period. Or basically the economic costs and the social costs and all that to move from Atlanta to Barcelona shape are just basically impossible. Now, what does that mean in the Latin American context? So this is a simple graph that tries to show here a definition, a sprawl index. So cities that are here have greater urban sprawl, all right? This is the population growth between 2000 and 2008. Cities that are higher have much higher growth rate. This is for the cities of Brazil. So the bubble shows you the size of the city. Okay, so you have Sao Paulo here, you have Rio de Janeiro, you have Belo Horizonte, okay? Now, what do you have here? The cities that are growing, small cities, growing fast with the largest sprawl. It is these cities that are making choices today that will lock them in either on unsustainable sprawl patterns that are more expensive, that use more energy, that use more water, that require totally different transportation systems, which a lot more emissions, or they move into this direction. How do these cities grow? It's not something that's going to be defined in, oh yes, when we get here, we'll figure out how to reduce the sprawl. You can't do that. And this is very much a practical question. So it's not the Sao Paulos and the Brasilias that have this issue. It's these cities that are changing. Again, it is the rapid growth that makes a huge difference into this direction. Now, in terms of urban transport, okay, Latin America, we already own a lot of cars. Eastern Europe, OECD Pacific, OECD Europe, US, Canada, China, and India right here. So not only we own already a lot of cars, automobiles, but actually we are growing extremely fast. So it's the region of the world where vehicle ownership is growing the fastest, even more than China. That surprised me, actually. But actually, it's a lot of people are buying. And why? And we'll get into that in a little bit. Okay. Yes, part of it is behavioral change, but part of it is the options. Okay? In terms of the cleanliness, the affordability, the efficiency of the public transport. Right? So a city that is sprawling very fast, a city that doesn't have the public transport, basically people very quickly start moving, not only buying, but also using private cars. Okay? Now, remember, and part of this, what we try to do in the global studies, to try to collect some of the information that the World Bank has been working with different countries in calculating what is the cost of environmental degradation. And it's not a trivial amount. This is the cost of environmental degradation for different countries as percentage of GDP equivalent, okay? So in some countries like Tunisia, 2%, but in some countries all the way like Ghana, you're looking at close to 10%. So these are not trivial amounts. The cost of environmental degradation, it is important when you start looking and calculating questions of impacts on health, impacts on the natural resources. All those kind of issues of environmental degradation, they start stacking up. It's an important part when you start comparing to GDP. And finally, for cities, more and more, and this is a reality that is taking place, the vulnerability to the disasters of today, the floods and the droughts, is only going to get worse in the future. And the problem is that you don't know in what direction, with what frequency and intensity those events are going to change, right? So the shapes of city, the ways, the options that they build today are going to define what it is that's going to happen in terms of resilience to the future altogether. And this is probably one of the areas where we have the least information, the least number of models, the least ability to understand and give advice on how to move forward as you are a city in that rapid growth situation. So again, issues of cleanliness, issues of efficiency, issues of resilience, and of course, issues of equity. And this is something that is an interesting example, and I'm sure that many of you know, but this is trying to put together the average distribution of energy consumption subsidy benefits across 20 different countries, okay? And basically what you see is the poorer 20% of the population only gets 7% of these benefits, which is the argument for many of these subsidies. The subsidies are there to protect the poor. Well, the poorer 20% only get 7%. Now the richer 20%, how much do they get? They get 43%. Why? Because they consume a lot more of this energy, and therefore they get a lot more of these subsidies. And therefore, the importance of the equity into all this, and the importance of the changes in that direction, and the challenges of reform and enough political buy-in to reform the way in which these subsidies go, is one of the big difficulties moving forward. But graphs like this are very clear in saying, okay, what are the distributional impacts of some of these subsidies and policies moving forward, okay? Now, so let me then try to say, what does it mean then, this concept of clean, efficient, and resilient in the urban context, okay? So on the clean, that's very clear. How do you really basically get the city to grow, trying to minimize the growth in terms of pollution and emissions, both local and global, okay? A city that is efficient is one that has a city design and greater density that allows the city to be more efficient. And basically the greater efficiency means the less congestion, in very practical ways, the less water consumption per capita that you have, the less energy consumption per capita that you have, okay? Now, in terms of resilience, see, how do you reduce the vulnerability of these assets to the disasters of today and the disasters of tomorrow? And for many cities, this is becoming not only an issue of how do you reduce the cost of dealing with these disasters, but it's also becoming an issue of competitiveness. When in Bangkok, you are flooded for 3 weeks, and an international company is going to decide where do you locate, then you start looking into those kind of questions altogether. So resilience is not a theoretical concept. Yes, this is something that we need to get ready for climate change for the future. It is very much the competitive of a city today. And again, and I keep repeating, the inclusive, how to expand the household services to slums and poor communities. All right, now what does it, let me try to take another sector, so that it's not only on the brown side of the process, but also trying to figure out what to do on agriculture and rural land use. Clean agriculture and agriculture that tries to minimize the emissions in terms of pollutants, local and global, fertilizer use, the process of nitrogen and phosphorus contamination, all the non-poisonous pollution, as well as the greenhouse gas emissions coming out of the agriculture. An efficient agriculture basically try to maintain the trajectory of high output growth, but without expanding the footprint, okay? Resilient, basically how do you have that same, again, is that urgency of the agricultural growth, taking into consideration the changing climatic conditions of today and of tomorrow. And finally, an inclusive, focus on smallholder competitiveness, including logistics, access to market, etc. Trying to maintain that balance is part of what we're trying to see, what it is that you see all together in practical, simple terms, right? Now, we did a little bit of calculation also. I'm trying to say there has been a lot of conversations on the green economy and what does it mean for some countries in terms of exports. And this is what we're beginning to see, the actual and potential green exports in developing countries in terms of percentage of total. And these are the green actual exports, and these are the potential. So it can go from the current green exports, and the report goes into a little bit of detail. It's not a trivial definition how to count green or non-green, going as from 3%, and it can be as high as 12, 13% altogether if you really get it all organized. Now, let me conclude with the challenges. Political economy, entrenched behaviors, limited and traditional financing, okay? Now, the political acceptability and governance failures, critical part of the whole process. I mean, the issues of subsidies, the issues of policies that really drive in terms of inefficient use of resources, that make choices in terms of growth patterns that are not necessarily the most resilient. This is what we see as one of the most important challenges. But in the World Bank, we tend to be very good and very focused on issues of investment programs, policies, and very much economic tools. Okay, the taxes, the subsidies, the whole process of the signals of the market, etc., to try to change this. But we're also beginning to see that in itself may not be enough. It's also the social acceptability and entrenched behaviors that define a lot of what these patterns. Even with the right signals in the market, even with the right investment programs and policies, there's still a lot that needs to be done in terms of individual, household, community choices vis-a-vis the relationship with environment and both built and natural. Finally, one of the really big challenges, and something that we're beginning to see, is that a lot of what is being put forward in these ideas of clean and efficiency and efficient growth pay for themselves. The whole issue of energy efficiency, the whole issues of water efficiency, there's a lot of these investments that get paid for itself, but part of the challenge is that a lot of the financing is needed today, even if it pays for itself. And this is an example of the calculation of our World Development Report in terms of climate change, where, yes, you talk about the $600 billion per annum to really deal with the climate financing need, but when you start incorporating some of what it is that pays for itself, in reality, the climate funding needs, it's a little bit less than 300. So into a lot of these discussions is trying to say, okay, let's try also to differentiate between financing needs and funding needs to start moving into that direction of greener and more inclusive growth patterns. Okay? So with that, let me stop, because part of what we wanted to have is a little bit more time for the conversation and to give as much time to the commentators, because this is part of our learning process altogether. And again, you have 2 copies of the report, one that we launched in Korea last week on the global inclusive clean growth, and then this one for Latin America today. Thank you very much.
Hey, thank you. Okay. Right, Carlos Rodriguez, to start.
Thank you, Cynthia. And first of all, I would like to thank the WW Center and the bank for the invitation. I spent the last couple of days studying, not reading, studying the report, and I felt very happy for very different reasons. One is that in the last year probably I have read so much about green economies and green growth. And I hate the green color because that's the color of my rival political party in Costa Rica. So, and in this case, I was able to connect the dots and link some ideas that's probably where I haven't seen before, particularly on the fact that, it's not just a report with a lot of facts and trying to explain out what green growth or green economy is, but put it in the context of development in Latin America. I totally agree that if there is some region in the world who has those enabling conditions to really move forward in a transformational way, is without any doubt Latin America. And how the report frames these challenges in terms of clean, efficient, resilient, and inclusive is great. This is something that for us, organizations from civil society really love. And this is one of the things that Conservation International has been moving forward in the Earth outcome definition and our mission strategies. So I felt very, very happy in reading the report and hoping that those drives many of the strategic engagement and investments that the bank does in many of the countries. I worked with the government of Costa Rica for many years, and I'll try to, bring some ideas in order to promote a nice discussion about the political challenges. And this is what Eddie, brought us at the end. And two things are extremely important. Yes, this region, like probably no other region in the world, has grown a lot in the last couple of decades. A lot of great achievements in terms of the social agenda and the economic agenda, but unfortunately with a high cost on our natural capital. And this is kind of the equation information we need to really generate. This growth has been based on loss of forests, loss of fisheries, loss of freshwater ecosystems, loss of species, contributing a lot to climate change. We keep this pace of growth in Latin America, we will double our carbon footprints in terms not just on forest-related deforestation or agricultural emissions. We will become a major source of emission based on our energy matrix as well. This growth has meant that we probably have one of the highest rates of deforestations in the region. So how do we make our leaders, decision makers, understand that this road cannot continue under the same consumption and production patterns, that we're eroding our natural capital, which basically underpins everything. And this tendency of growth is going beyond certain logical limits. I work a lot on protected areas, or I have worked a lot on protected areas, and for 25 years I work in all Latin American protected areas, and I'm extremely concerned about the threats around oil and gas and mining in protected areas. This is becoming extremely attractive to many policymakers, to many governments, making quick bucks, quick gains in short terms in order to achieve their projected growth, and they will be really considering changing legislations and policy around protected areas. And you got Amazon countries, or you have Mesoamerican countries where you see this tendency. And this is, and here I do have one very concrete, probably my only recommendation to the report is, the role of forests in protected areas is extremely important. If you see the role of protected areas and forests in development in the region is crucial. Do you know where the water for the major urban cities comes from? They come from cloud forests, which are protected in the Andes or in Mesoamerica or in Mexico. We haven't been able to generate the information in a language understood by decision makers, so these protected areas, these forest ecosystems are fully incorporated in the national planning and decision-making processes. When we talk about protected areas in our regions, we see them, or, well, not we, decision makers traditionally see protected areas as a cost, as a item in the budget, but they are unable to really understand the economic benefit of keeping those healthy ecosystems, in this case protected areas, generating services. In Costa Rica, we learned many years ago that unless we are able to assign value and demonstrate the economic benefit of protected areas and forests, we're not going to protect biodiversity. That is why Costa Rica has been quite successful in protecting biodiversity. Costa Rica in Latin America, probably in the world, is the only country who has tripled the income per capita and doubled the size of the forest in the same 25 years. Most of the countries of the world have been able to double or triple their income, but losing a big chunk of their natural capital. In the case of Costa Rica, as I just mentioned, we were able not only to increase GDP per capita, in this case almost triple, the last 25, 30 years, but we went from the number one with the highest rate of deforestation per capita in the world to one of the few countries who has been able to restore forests. Well, in terms of biology, this is a great achievement. Our challenge is not stopping deforestation. It's more complex nowadays. It's associated to genetic erosion and loss of biodiversity. We stop deforestation, increase biomass, but that don't necessarily means that we are keeping a healthy ecosystem, and this is kind of the things that we are working on. But the bottom line and the learned lessons around this is that we understood the language that major decision makers speaks. And we began to generate information in that language, and it is the economy of nature. And we began to generate a lot of information associated to that. Remember the first studies we did in the mid-1990s associated to the contribution of national parks to the local economy in terms of how much water is being generated by parks used for hydroelectricity instead of importing oil and producing the same amount. So we began to put and assign values to protected areas and forests. And at the same time, we were always also surfing this big wave of ecotourism, and it was very easy for us to really demonstrate the contribution. Ecotourism generates $2.2 billion a year, and Costa Rica doesn't compete in sun and beach, go and drink and dance and party all you can do for 3 days. We compete in nature-based conservation where we invite family to spend 10, 11 days learning from nature and helping nature. So this is the kind of information we generate. While we were doing that, we began to understand better the failures of markets. The decision makers, they base their decision on the base available economic information. If our accounting system is unable to really reflect what we do positive, negatively with nature, they will not reflect the conservation and sustainable use, rational use of those resources in their decision-making processes. So we were destroying forests, losing fisheries, eroding our soils, and polluting our waters, and that was not reflected in the national accounting. We began a process that was very innovative at that time, which was trying to reflect some positive externalities. If we are able to reflect the value of forest conservation and make it economically attractive to very specific incentives, we may be able to compete with the other market stimulus. Basically, destroying the forest and filling the landscape with cows or soybean or coffee or banana and sugar cane. At that time, we were talking also about climate change, and in 1997, we launched a very ambitious program, which is the payment for environmental services, where people were paid for a service. This is not a subsidy. This is not government aid. This is a payment for a service that was given by owners of land based on decisions to keep forests. And forests are very valuable in terms of supplying services. Carbon fixation is a very known one, water production, and many others. So we designed this mechanism whereby people are being paid for forest conservation through their environmental services. And we began paying the cost of opportunity of doing cattle ranching, $42 per hectare per year in 1997, because we put a tax on fossil fuels. And this is something which is very interesting. The world is discussing in the context of the climate convention how we're going to internalize all those services. Well, Costa Rica put a tax on fossil fuels. We've been paying environmental services for forest conservation associated to carbon, water, and biodiversity. But carbon is probably the biggest one. A few years later, the bank joined us in an effort that has been instrumental. We designed a lot of projects, particularly one main project, which is eco-markets, where the bank and Costa Rica learn about the positive benefits of creating positive incentives around nature conservation, and it did work. We learned that the forest is destroyed not because farmers hate or people hate forests, because they take simple economic decisions. And if the conditions are not there in order to protect, in terms of the economics, people will keep on destroying nature. And we learn many things. And one is the benefit sharing and the inclusive aspects. I mean, this mechanism is a good example of how to create positive incentives, making forest conservation attractive in terms of the economics, but also it generated a lot of possibilities to increase individual income and generate a lot of well-being, particularly to those beneficiaries, which most of them are poor farmers in indigenous communities. 40% of the beneficiaries of the payment of environmental services are people who are very poor. I'm talking farmers without jobs and salaries. They have a subsistence activities, indigenous communities. In Costa Rica, indigenous communities are being paid for their carbon services. They receive in between $2 and $4 million a year, depends on some variables there. This has become the most important source of revenue for indigenous communities in Costa Rica. And some very interesting things has happened. I have, tour around those indigenous communities. I always ask, in what you invest your resources, and they always come with the same things: schools, health clinics, education, infrastructure, things that the government has proven not be able to get there, and they've been doing in investing there. And the social studies of central government show us that this has increased their living conditions dramatically. And the most, the most revealing case for me was when I visited another indigenous community and I asked them, how do you invest your money because of the carbon payment? And they told me, and it was very funny, but they told me, we hired the most prestigious law firm in Costa Rica to sue everybody around us to regain title and ownership of our ancestral lands. And that was great. That was doing a workshop with the Carbon Forest Partnership Fund and the readiness process. I was amazed by that. So that's a good example of, a mechanism that moves our economy to a greener one, being able to understand the economics of conservation, and creating mechanisms that contributes to poverty alleviation, that spreads the benefit of these services, because the money does not come from the government, and this is something which is extremely important. We went through 20 years of forest incentives where the government was putting the money, which is basically what is happening in Latin America right now with the forest policy. This is kind of a second generation of forest incentives where those who receive the benefit pay for that benefit. In Costa Rica, everybody who uses fossil fuels pays a tax or a way to compensate for carbon sequestration by somebody somewhere. We began doing it for forest conservation, and then with the bank, we began to learn that there's a lot of carbon-related services in the whole landscape. So we moved from the forest to the agroforestry system, to the cattle ranching. I mean, a lot of very, very interesting things. I think that two challenges are extremely, extremely important. I mean, we had those very interesting experiences. Just a few countries has been able to, take these very innovative cases and mainstream into national policy. And this is something that I would really like in the first page of the report. The report says, Latin America has done a lot of great things, some of them cutting edge, innovative, but that hasn't become national policy. And this is one of the challenges. The second challenge, and 2 minutes on this one because it's extremely important, is one that we always lose to focus on, which is the fact that there is no major political and economic incentive to do the leap forward for our governments. I mean, what is the incentive for Brazil, the biggest economy in Latin America, to change what they do? Well, we come and approach them and talk about, the future value of carbon and the services of the Amazon and the other biomes. That won't change their position, and we have seen that. I mean, it pays so much at this time, based on the climate of the market conditions, to keep the business as usual. How do we break this vicious circle right now? Most of our politicians are measured by just one very single item, which is growth. You can fail in infrastructure, you can fail in education, you can fail in but if you can prove that you generate growth, which means jobs, if you can prove that you were able to obtain your growth goals, you are going to be rewarded, politically speaking. We are coming here with a new way of doing business. And that new way of doing business confronts this very normal, traditional way of decision-making. So how do we break this vicious circle, particularly by the fact that governments last 4 or 5 years? When you see head of states talking about green growth, it's like music to their ears. But for me, it's very clear that they are thinking, this is something for the next government. It's not for us. I'm committed for 5% growth. I will go with agribusiness, oil and gas, mining, las locomotoras in Colombia. We move those sectors, and somebody will come and do the transformation. Unfortunately, this is not going to happen. And we need, 3, 4 governments very well aligned with different structures, which are not there. And those are the bottom line of my comment here. We are moving towards greener ways of production, but at the same time, we haven't done the other transformational part of it, which is the institutional part of it. We tend to believe that with the same institutional framework, the public agencies in our government that has created this problem, with those same agencies, we're going to fix the problem. We're going to fix the mess. And that is not correct. We cannot obtain our goals in sustainability with the same institutional framework that has created. I was the Minister of Environment, but in Costa Rica, the Minister of Environment is also the Minister of Energy, Mines, and Water, as opposed to the rest of Latin America, where you got a Minister of Energy, Mines, and Water. And I finish with an anecdote. Once I invited to a meeting of ministers of mining of Latin America in Argentina, Buenos Aires. I went there. I went to a very fancy hotel. We introduced ourselves. I was the last one in the table. And I said, I'm Carlos Manuel Rodriguez, the Minister of Environment of Costa Rica. Dead silence.
Yeah.
Dead silence. Everybody looked at me like a weird thing. And the chairman, the Minister of Mines of Argentina, said, Mr. Minister, you are in the wrong meeting. And I said to him, no, I'm not in the wrong meeting. I'm also the Minister of Mines in Costa Rica. The Minister of Mines and Environment is the same in Costa Rica. Well, they treated me very bad for 3 days. They felt that I was a spy, a conspirator, an enemy. Of course, I made their life miserable for 3 days, telling them that I don't understand how come a fellow minister thinks that the other minister is his enemy, his opponent. I mean, governments work in a cabinet form. It's a group. It's a political team. Everybody works helping the president achieve his political goals. And we work like a soccer team. You got the goalkeeper, Minister of Defense. You got the defense, Minister of Finance. You got everybody. By the way, the Minister of Environment is always in the bench waiting for the opportunity. Give me a chance. We work aligned so we can move the ball to the box so the president can score. This is the theory. In reality, that is not the case. We work on silos, we don't complement, we don't collaborate, and we don't like each other. And we can talk on different scales. In forest services, do you know that in Latin America, 40% of the forest services are still in the Ministry of Agriculture? Do you know what kind of policies those countries do have? They see forests not as carbon bags, or as a way to make people get out of poverty. They see forests as just timber who should be harvested right now so we can move on with cows or whatever. Those are the institutional transformation that we need. And I think that, and this is a recommendation for the report, as quick as we move in greening up our mechanisms of production and consumption, I think that we need to do the same effort in at least generating dialogues within the political community, designing institutional gap analysis to know where we are and set some baselines, and began a trial learning by doing process where we align the institutional framework with the green economy. That's why probably, I thought that that's the understanding that the second theme in Rio Plus 20 is the institutional framework for sustainability. Unfortunately, we have concentrated on the UN institutional framework. We haven't discussed it at the most important level, which is at the national level. So thank you, and it was I'm delighted to be here today.
Great. Carlos Manuel, it's wonderful. Wonderful, and I do think that there's probably no country in Latin America that's done more than Costa Rica in this area. And maybe during the question and answer period, you can tell us how you were able to create the political consensus within Costa Rica to make the transformations that did take place. I'm sure it's welcome news also on K Street that the indigenous communities in Costa Rica were hiring lawyers with some of the $2 to $4 million in subsidies that the government provided. I can imagine. On that note, Alec, we welcome your remarks.
Thanks very much, Cindy. I'm delighted to be here. Thanks to you and thanks to the Wilson Center for giving me this opportunity to present my 2 cents. It's a special pleasure and an honor to collaborate again with Carlos Manuel Rodriguez, an old friend from my years at the Nature Conservancy, for which Costa Rica was and still is a very important incubator for biodiversity conservation. And I'm sure if you didn't know this before, you could tell from his remarks right now. He's been a visionary leader in this field for at least 20 years. So it's a pleasure to be with you again, Carlos Manuel. I'm also pleased, I'm going to comment more on your report because I was never a minister of environment like Carlos Manuel, but I'm pleased to comment on this interesting and very useful, in my view, World Bank report just presented by Eddie. The report is the kind of document that should have legs, as they say, because it is grounded in real experience, it is pragmatic, it is non-ideological, even non-theoretical. It is well organized, easy to understand, and the report demonstrates clearly how much Latin American and Caribbean countries have done on vitally important aspects of green and inclusive economic growth and should stimulate them to do even more. I bet most governments in Latin America are not even aware of all the data you have collected. Most important, I think, this report should serve as a basis for intense sharing of experiences among the key players in Latin America and the Caribbean, as well as between them and colleagues elsewhere around the world. As the report states up front, converting these innovative experiences into mainstream policies and widespread practices is the challenge. And this report, I think, helps lay the groundwork for meeting that challenge. Of course, some could quibble with the report's division of the region's experiences into the specific categories used here, and for those who haven't read the report yet, I'll list them very quickly here. Urban and infrastructure services, natural resources and rural services, urban consumption and rural production, energy, water and sanitation services, urban transport, rural market access, water resource management, and agriculture. But I think these categories are adequate. They comprise virtually all of the salient issues with which we have to deal, and they form a solid basis for further discussion, and even more important than discussion, further action. Like Carlos Manuel, as a conservationist, I would have liked to have seen the importance of protected areas highlighted a little bit more explicitly. It's in the report, but a little more explicitly for the reasons that Carlos Manuel outlined. But these categories relate various issues and solutions to each other, which I think is important. Most interesting, perhaps, is the linkage between urban and rural issues. Very often these things are addressed in a sort of stovepipe, isolated fashion. And this approach, the approach that you've adopted in your report, Eddie, this approach tends to increase the attractiveness of possible solutions, it seems to me, and also stimulates broader, holistic thinking in addressing the issues. The underlying assumption that sustainable, inclusive economic growth can in fact must incorporate environmentally sound and efficient policies is crucial. It is surprising to me that there are still those around the world who doubt this, but that's the case, so we have to keep saying it. This paper, with its recitation of practical measures already taken by several countries, should help dispel those doubts. This focus resonates with me because during my time at the Conservancy, we strove to make conservation consistent with economic growth and development and vice versa. And we were among the pioneers in defining environmental services that Carlos Manuel has talked about, learning a lot from Costa Rica, of course, and making the economic case for forest conservation as a key element of water and climate management. I don't want to go on at length here because we really want to have a good discussion. And Cindy, aware that retired diplomats can be very verbose, said I can have from 2 to 10 minutes.
No.
But let me make a few specific points. First, in general terms, Latin America and the Caribbean are well endowed with favorable natural conditions for green economic growth. Copious supplies of water, extensive mineral resources, fertile land, rich biodiversity, a variety of climatic conditions, relatively sparse population, etc. These favorable conditions can lead, however, to a relaxed approach to green issues, which is what Carlos Manuel was talking about a minute ago. And that is extremely dangerous. The favorable conditions can disappear very quickly. We've seen examples of that throughout the region. But these positive conditions afford the region with distinct advantages compared to other parts of the world and must be husbanded, nurtured, and used in ways that will continue their existence and the advantages they confer. Second, as the report points out, there is no single path to green and inclusive economic growth. Each set of circumstances is unique, requires different mixtures of policy instruments. But Latin America and the Caribbean has a wealth of experiences that, if broadly shared, can contribute to solutions elsewhere. We need to find ways to facilitate that sharing, some sort of mechanism for facilitating that sharing, and maybe the bank can do that, take a lead in that. Third, it seems to me that the most important threads that tie virtually all the issues and their solutions together are energy and water, a point the report illustrates if it does not make it directly. Energy consumption in the region has more than doubled over the last 2 decades and will likely continue to increase at that pace, at least this pace, into the future. Handled poorly, this challenge can affect considerable damage on the environment and sustainable development. Handled well, it can foster great benefits in both respects. Fortunately, Latin America and the Caribbean possess an exceptionally broad diversity of energy resources that affords conditions for effective management of energy production and consumption. Efficient distribution of energy across frontiers, international integration of electrical and communications grids will be key in this regard, in my view, and the region can really be a world leader in this area. Now, the region is blessed with extensive freshwater resources that by and large have not been damaged beyond repair. There are exceptions, and the report touches on that, but by and large, unlike places like China, the water in Latin America and Caribbean is in pretty good shape. However, even these great water supplies will face increasing demand that will force very difficult decisions. As the report notes, 32 million people lack access to safe water in the region, and 123 million lack access to sanitation. And most urban wastewater in Latin America and the Caribbean is still untreated. Over 50% is untreated. And water, however, is also essential for electric power, agriculture, industry, and transportation, all of which have growing appetites. Latin America and the Caribbean will face major challenges in determining how best to distribute water among the many users, and they must establish effective mechanisms for doing so and for resolving disputes that inevitably will arise. And agriculture deserves special attention, in my view. If Latin America is to be a major global breadbasket, as many prognosticate, efficient distribution and use of water will be absolutely essential. Another challenge is finding ways to get water economically to those sub-regions faced with water scarcity, because there's plenty of water, but it's not everywhere in the region. And of course, avoiding further water pollution and cleaning up what is already contaminated is crucial, as is protection and restoration of the water factories. It's a term we used to use. Maybe you still do, Carlos Manuel. The forests and marshes that collect, retain, and distribute water gradually to lakes and rivers. In sum, I find this report to be a valuable contribution that may contribute to thoughtful, pragmatic, solutions-oriented discussions at Rio+20 and elsewhere. And it should encourage Latin American and Caribbean countries to adopt even bolder, more creative policies to achieve green growth and to share them with each other and around the globe. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Hardly verbose, eloquent, I think is the word that I would use. We're open for questions and comments. I'd ask you to please wait for a microphone and state your name and who you work for so that we can all kind of get to know one another. I see a question up here. Why don't we take a couple of questions and then we'll come back to the panelists. We'll start up here. Other hands? People are just floored, right? They agree with everything you say and they just don't want anything more. Go ahead, sir.
I'm Farzin Illich with Council on Hemispheric Affairs. I want to ask you about social acceptability. In our experience in the U.S., this is a crucial issue. Like in a city like L.A., you have, it's almost an insult to get in the bus. You know, there's a film called Crash, 2 African Americans talking. One says, "What, do you know why they make the bus windows so big?" He says, "No." He says, "To humiliate African Americans who ride the bus." And they have created a very good bus system, and low-income people use it. You can go anywhere. And you can just imagine if they did a tram system, efficient train system, it would improve the lives of everybody. Half of their life people are spending on. So what are you investing in terms of changing the mindset. And if that can happen, I mean, in terms of hybrids, it's happening because a lot of celebrities, like Leonardo DiCaprio bought a hybrid. He bought one for all his family. So there is some movement in that direction. But that may be a crucial issue.
Other questions? I actually have a question for all of you, and it goes to the stovepiping issue that Carlos Manuel pointed out. I mean, with the huge demand from China that, the bank and others have pointed out has been one of the major factors behind the region's exceedingly positive, growth rates over the last decade. I mean, how do you change the incentives for expanding, mega mining projects, developing in Argentina, the Neuquén, fields for natural gas using hydraulic, fracturing? I mean, how, given the money that is to be made, in mining and energy industries, Colombia is another example, which has dramatically increased its production of oil. How do you change that nexus of incentives and change the mentality within governments so that these issues are seen more holistically? And Alec, I mean, having served in Peru, I mean, we know that yesterday there were, the country declared a state of emergency because of, protests involving confrontations, over, big mining conglomerates and local communities. So again, how do you encourage governments to, keep all of these things in mind as they move forward? I mean, Costa Rica perhaps had the advantage of not having, major oil or gas deposits, that would create this inherent conflict that we see in so many countries. So that would be another question. Perhaps one more, and then we'll go back to the panel. Sure, right here. Wait for the microphone if you could.
Jane Monaghan, I'm a British journalist specializing in Latin America. It's my understanding 20 years ago in Rio, the World Bank spoke about the possibility of doing something about green accounting. Nothing happened. And in terms of raising awareness and improving maybe the educational side of this whole green development, is there any chance the World Bank will adopt that in future?
Why don't we take people in reverse order, Alec, and then Carlos Manuel, and then Ede?
I'll be very brief. If I understood your question, you're talking about buses and trains and more efficient transportation systems. Well, I think that the report touches quite a bit on the Transmilenio in Bogota. When I was in Brazil, Jaime Lerner was the mayor of Curitiba. That's where I think they really started this kind of thing in southern Brazil. And many countries have tried that. And I think we're doing it more in this country as well, because it's a heck of a lot cheaper very often to use a bus system, especially one that's even can be environmentally sound if they're electric or if they are fueled by natural gas, rather than more expensive train systems. But that's a choice that you have to make in each specific circumstance. On the mining questions, we could talk about that all afternoon, but I can just say I think about my Peru experience, which was when I was there as ambassador, but also later I worked with the Inter-American Development Bank on the Camisea gas project there. The Peruvian government, I would say, has never been out in front of these issues, ever. It's always reactive. And this is a legacy of 500 years, in my view. That is to say, the state does not have a real, if you will, interest in what's going on in the hinterland, except sporadically when problems arise. So there's a lack of trust between the government on the one hand and the people in those areas. And without some kind of trust, without some kind of belief that the governmental authorities will help you achieve your objectives, these people live in constant consternation and concern about these big firms that are coming in there to do these things. Very often the firms are far more socially advanced than the government. But the firms can't do things all by themselves. And in other words, you can't build schools and put health posts and things like that, or even discuss seriously how to manage water supplies without some government participation. Very often it's not there. But we could talk about this for a long time. But I see these problems as not going away for a long, long time until they start getting out there and establishing real interest and real communication with the local communities and getting a real idea of what their views are, and giving them real mechanisms for expressing those and having those views actually make a difference in what happens. And so until that happens, you're going to have these outbursts where people resort to blocking roads and things like that, which is what they feel is their only recourse. Now, this is starting to improve. They've decentralized the government. These new regional governments are not very efficient or effective. Of course not. They've never done this before, so it's going to take a while for them to get better. But it's going to be a long process. Going back to the broader point of how you get the environmental and social concerns adequately incorporated into the mining projects to the extent possible. Sometimes you can't do everything everybody wants, but you can do that. That just requires continual work, and Carlos Manuel can talk more about this, at the governmental level and with civil society to try to make these kinds of judgments and get these projects with their attendant costs incorporated into the project plan, so that you can at least avoid or attenuate or mitigate these issues. I don't think anyone believes you should stop all mining everywhere in the world. The question is, how do you get this done in the most careful balance? And you use that term many, many times of your 4 different criteria. That's going to take a lot of leadership and a lot of work over the next few years.
Okay, thank you. Related to the question of China and what do we do? Well, if I were a senior politician, recognizes that probably those decisions won't allow me to be reelected, I will do 4 things. One is try to level, I don't know how do you say in English, but I think it's how to level the ground.
Level the playing field.
Level the playing field. I mean, first of all, phasing out, taking all perverse incentives and subsidies for the sectors. Second, I will immediately begin to fully internalize all those negative externalities generated by those extractive activities, industries. You know, mining, oil, gas, and the other extractive activities, logging, they don't pay for the loss of biodiversity, the contribution to climate change, water pollution, soil erosion. They pass that bill to somebody down the road, probably my sons, my grandsons, or somebody else in the future. They privatize the profits and socialize the costs, and that cannot continue to happen. The third element is our countries, the benefit for our country, well, the explanation from our politicians on the benefits of this foreign investment in our countries are jobs and taxes. But at the end, we're not getting much. I mean, yeah, jobs is good. We can improve the quality of the jobs, and we can, do a lot of things. But the issue on taxes is something that's still, a virgin area. In the best of the cases, they pay 30% income taxes. But the most important source of revenue is not the income tax, rather than the right of access, the fee of access. If you go to Norway and you ask the government for a oil drilling permit, they charge you 78% in taxes. In Latin America, as an average, the fee access is in between 2 and 5% of the value of the resource. And the government doesn't even have the capacity to know what is the size of the reservoir or the value of the resource there. So we are in their hands. So this should change immediately. Our countries are sitting on top of very rich resources, and we're giving it for free. Very similar to when the Europeans arrived in the Americas 500 years ago. We're doing basically the same thing, giving our richness for very few things. And the fourth, and also extremely important element, is accountability and transparency. I mean, we cannot hope to change dramatically the things if we don't account and do things in a very straightforward, transparent manner. The good governance is important. And a few years ago, I went to a country in Latin America. I won't say the name, but it's an English-speaking country in Latin America where they had a lot of forest concessions, and I sit with the government officials. My first question was, when we were talking about the forest experience and the forest concession, and my first question was, can I have a look to the forest agreement, the contract with the company? And the four guys from the government who were there began to look at each other like if I was a weird kind of thing. And in like 5 minutes, they were, just changing eye contact. And one of them said, well, sir, this is a confidential thing. We cannot give it to you. I mean, those things should be in line. And anybody in any place in the world can access those contracts, those concessions, and those contracts and concessions should be very well defined in public policies, legal frameworks, and regulations where civil society and everybody has a possibility to question, to investigate, and to say something. These are resources from the people, but they are administrated on a very informal, to say the least, manner. So those four things are extremely important and things that we cannot keep on having there. And the other question around the Rio 92 and the bank and accounting. The bank did a very interesting study in 1993 in Costa Rica about the loss of natural capital, I would say right now. And it was very important to us at that time because it was an eye-opener. We began to realize, and we did it on forests, fisheries, and soil. And that was key for us in Costa Rica. It opened our eyes to something that we didn't have information, and we began to explore. And it was very interesting revealing. Now the bank is taking the lead on very concrete projects like Waves, where they're launching a great effort with some pilots in some very specific countries, 5 or 8 countries, where they're really developing information methodology and things like that. The political challenge is very simple. They show us the cost of nature loss in terms of GDP in between 2 and 10%. Well, a few years ago when I was minister working on this field and working with the Minister of Finance on this matter, we developed some very interesting things there, and I asked the minister, okay, we're ready. We would like to really formalize a mechanism and a methodology where we should internalize those negative externalities in our national accounting. And the minister, who has been supportive of this process until then, said, that is fine, that is good, but I won't do it. Because I won't be the first Minister of Finance who will report zero growth. I will be fired. So how are we going to do when we develop these methodologies and these capacities and generate all that information with that political barrier? It's something that, again, we need to really begin to think and understand. And that is why I brought the issue of the institutional framework for sustainability that will help us move things in a more coherent way towards the direction that we wish.
Okay, so look, I mean, Alec and Carlos Manuel have given fantastic answers, so let me just try to give compliments and not try to repeat into the process. Mining, look, personally very concerned. The region that is receiving the largest portion of exploratory money for mining is Latin America. 24% of gold exploration is in Latin America, 21% for minerals in Latin America, and you start doing the overlay between where those resources are vis-a-vis biodiversity hotspots and the indigenous peoples communities, boom.
And protected areas.
Protected areas, in that sense. And therefore, it is a very critical issue altogether, and the situation is not going to change. When you have 13 million people in China moving to cities every year, and actually the government in the new 5-year plan coming and say we do want to accelerate urbanization. That's a fundamental part of our economic development, and we just barely passed the 50% urbanization rate in China. Then the situation is not going to change. The needs for these minerals as part of that process is going to continue. A Chinese citizen that moves from a rural area to urban area changes the diet immediately. It starts eating only 1/3 of the rice, and it starts changing towards more chicken and pork. So the diets change completely, and that trend is going to continue. And therefore, what are the feedstock for that new diet is going to come from imports. Because basically, China has 20% of the population of the world, but it only has 9% of the arable land, and that actually is being degraded very fast into this process, to a point that they just have defined a quota system of high productive agricultural land that cannot be lost. Basically, if you build a highway, you need to move exactly on the topsoil and move it at sea so that you don't lose a single hectare of that land. So Latin America will continue to be a center of production of those things, and therefore, that part of the incorporation of the policies is not something to be done later. It's not that you're going to be doing the mining, cleaning up later, okay? Doing the production, expanding the agricultural frontier, destroying the biodiversity, and coming back later. You are, in many of these countries, at the frontier of no return points into this process, and therefore, some of these things, as I was saying, you may be able to fix 20 years later if you make mistakes in infrastructure, right? The way that you grow your cities, the loss of the diversity of species is permanent. You can't change that to this process. So the issues of transparency, critical. The issues of benefit sharing that Carlos Manuel was saying, critical. Yes, you can have, even in a perfect system, when you have the fees and the taxes, those things are going to take 5 to 10 years to trickle down back to communities. They are not going to be waiting 5 to 10 years. And that creates a lot of the conflicts in that sense. And therefore, a mining sector that is not truly inclusive is going to have more and more of these social clashes altogether into the process. Behavioral change is a critical part of the whole process. And out of this report and analysis over the last year, it has for us, it's become a lot more important. And we haven't done, basically, we have very little experience on that process. We were checking to see how many behavioral change specialists we have in the bank, and we only have one. So, and yes, we're very good, as I was saying, on investment programs, on policies, on economic tools, but there's a very important portion of behavior, so relationship between individuals, houses, communities with their environment, the way that they perceive what it is, the consequences of everything that they're doing. And therefore, we're trying to start extracting a lot more of this process. The global report has a full chapter on trying to say what it is that we know about behavioral economics and about behavioral change, because everything on the sustainability has that very important component, and the reality is that we don't know much about it. And we're beginning to realize that there's a lot of interesting studies and pilots here and there on how people opt in or opt out of certain behaviors that are more positive or negative for the environment based on very strange ways of behaviors that are totally independent of tariffs and signals and market forces and all that. So that's an unwritten chapter, let me put it that way, and something to be working on. On green accounting, yes, they pushed 20 years ago, and actually, over the last 5-7 years, the results that you see on the cost of environmental degradation are each of those bars that you saw in the graph is basically a very detailed study at the national level that the World Bank has been working with different countries over the last 5-7 years, and that raises awareness a lot. But what we are beginning to see is that yes, some countries are very interested, and many are doing, Costa Rica, one of them, looking at that, but very different methodologies. So what we're trying to do here, and we began working about a year ago and in preparation for Rio Plus 20, is to take a fresh look at that, trying to bring and update some of these methodologies, trying to work with countries around the world to try to see, can we have a little bit more standardization of this process for comparability? And what Carlos Manuel was mentioning, our WAVES program, being built with several partners, the wealth accounting and valuation of ecosystem services, or in more general sense, how do you value national and natural wealth, is picking up. And what we are working very hard right now is to see if we can get 50 countries and 50 large businesses to commit to start working in this methodology with more commonalities in that direction. So stay tuned. We're moving very hard on that direction. We have a few pilots where we are beginning to push the envelope in Latin America. Colombia and Costa Rica are at the frontier of that process. And we're also discovering that many countries are already doing it. I mean, China was doing it, but it's interesting because they do it. And when I was sitting down always with the research institute that was working on that for the Ministry of Environment and for the State Council, well, actually, it is confidential information. We never got it, the reports. But because they realize how important, I mean, the numbers it is in that process. The cost of many of these environmental degradations is very important. And while China may be moving very fast on certain directions in terms of greening its growth, when you look at the portion of wastewater that is treated in China today, you compare and given the income levels that they have per capita today, it is a much greener wastewater sector than anybody else in the world, than any developed country. So, look, many people don't remember that the big push for wastewater treatment in the U.S. was basically in the 60s. In that sense, air quality began to be pushed in the 70s. So it wasn't too far ago. So actually, it was a much richer society that began to tackle these issues than in some of the issues that China is handling. And they focus a lot more on some of the engineering solutions that are easier to tackle into this process. And we see some of the big challenges that they have ahead into all this process. And again, that connection between China and Latin America and what we're beginning to see in the World Bank, that over the last 10 years, the largest 7 economies of Latin America have their economic growth is now far more correlated to the Chinese growth, means that these are no longer local environmental issues, that a lot of this trade becomes an important part of the equation, and that we don't believe that that's going to change. If anything, it's going to strengthen even more. Last year, China became the most important trading partner for Brazil and Chile for the first time. That's not going to change. That actually, if anything, is going to increase, given the trends that we see in China that are very core: urbanization and basically change of diets for the population altogether. Before I forget, we have a few of the authors here. Richard Amania, who worked a lot in the process of putting together all this report. Ariel Yepes working on the energy sector. And Richard has been working a lot on the questions that you were posing that actually are very real: biodiversity and protected areas. Does this framework work for that? And the answer is that not as perfectly as we wanted. We are still working very much on trying to figure out that connection, because if you only try to calculate the economic benefits out of biodiversity, sometimes biodiversity doesn't win. And therefore, it has to have additional issues of behavioral change that change the way in which society relates to those biodiversity values altogether. So the evaluation is a step in the right direction, but as Richard always tells me, the more that you calculate biodiversity and the more that you analyze, the less valuable it is for some reason. Okay? So the economics is still out there to be improved in that direction.
We still have some time for questions. I see 4 hands. So here, here, and here.
Thank you. My name is Anna Lerner. I work in the energy unit of the Latin America Caribbean region at the World Bank. This behavior change talk fits very nicely with my one comment and my one question. One key instrument to achieve inclusive green growth, but perhaps also a big challenge to it, is people, I would say. And I wonder if it would have made sense to dedicate a specific section in this report to people, to jobs, to employment. I can see that the inclusive objective, it taps into employment and jobs, but I wonder if it could have been more explicit. I'm talking about things like what types of jobs we will need to implement this agenda and what trade-offs that might bring. My question is actually more, spins on this. How can we give youth the adequate skills to be change agents and drive this agenda? And I guess a more broader question would be, what is the role of youth in this paradigm shift that we're talking about?
Hi, Scott Smith, U.S. Department of Commerce. My question relates to trying to draw politics back into the equation. You have Costa Rica, which I was fortunate enough to be there for 3 months a while ago, and extremely green policies, very nice. They've thought about it for a long time, but the problem is the rest of Latin America and the world are somewhat different, and so the problems of implementing these same things are more troublesome in the sense that Costa Rica is a small country. It's centrally, it can be controlled by one central government versus the federal government in the United States and Brazil or Mexico or Argentina, and it can actually link together ecotourism kind of issues together with economic development in the sense that Colombia, which has similar biodiversity, can't because it's 20 million people, even if you don't count the FARC and all those problems that they have. It just can't sell economic growth based on ecotourism. And getting back to a larger country like Brazil and in the United States, for example, where it's a federal kind of government, where you have in Brazil, they recently passed a land use policy that goes very against trying to do some of the things that that we're talking about here in saving an environment, the jungle space, saving biodiversity. And recently we had a candidate for president who was coming from a Green Party, and she competed in the Silva, and she competed in the presidential election. She lost, and it looks like that will actually make it harder for a Green Party, for example, to actually influence the debate. So I just want to look into your guys' experience and how to get the individual behavior issues actually implemented through the political system.
Sure.
Thank you. James Hooser, Georgetown University. My question also is related to incorporating people into these more sustainable economic growth. Mr. Rodriguez, you mentioned working with indigenous communities to protect forests in where they live. However, throughout much of Latin America, Brazil, Colombia, Peru, other countries, those three countries come to mind. There are often attitudes amongst policymakers and elites that question whether indigenous communities or Afro-Latino communities are capable or deserve to be treated as partners in national development projects. And so my question is, are there any efforts from the international development community to bring projects into the region that have incentives for policymakers to work with these communities as partners? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. My name is John Parker. I work for The Economist magazine. I just wonder whether you've given any thought to what is it about Latin America that's enabled it to be a kind of laboratory for green growth over the last 20 years, and whether what other regions of the world could learn from that. I mean, there's something about Latin America that would be replicable in Africa or South Asia. Thank you.
One last question. I mean, a lot of the questions and certainly the presentations have focused on the actions or what needs to change in governments, both national and subnational. Are there any experiences of private sector companies being in the forefront of thinking about how to achieve this kind of balance, particularly in the most sensitive sectors that we've talked about, mining and energy development? Okay, final round. Eddie, why don't we start with you?
Okay. The role of youth. I think that, look, a lot of what happened in Rio 20 years ago was very much linked to the energy of the youth in that process. So we do hope that that level of energy is picked up in Rio +20, because that's where a lot of the change is going to happen. For us, what we're beginning to see in Latin America is that an important part of the change or the non-change is going to deal with the fact that of the growth of the middle class in Latin America. And therefore is very much linked to, again, the behavioral change. With a middle class that is rising and that is expanding, the way in which a middle class household relates to the environment and understands the consequences of choices of consumption is going to be a very important part of where we see trends in Latin America to the future. That's a variable that is going to be very, very important as we look forward. In terms of the large countries and federal systems, yes, look, small countries, while they may be easier to change in terms of action, that does not necessarily mean that actually they are the only solution to all this process. A federal system that has the ability to put clear rules of the game for subnationals to behave and make choices and move in directions and create competitive frameworks that allow them to move into greener growth trajectories is not out of the question, but it has to be very clear. And therefore, what Carlos Manuel was mentioning of trying to understand differences in roles and responsibilities and trying to package actions that make governments work in a more aligned way is not only a question of the central government, but it's also that relationship between federal and subnational altogether. What I always like to say about Costa Rica is not also that it's out of the goodness of the heart, but it's really a realization that natural resources are a core part of the competitiveness at the global scale. And Costa Rica has been able to do that switch in a way that everybody has that trademark that of Costa Rican natural resources in that very strong balance. So it's an example of how do you look at what it is, who you are as a country, what you are as a society, and what are the competitiveness factors that you have at disposal, and how do you play with them to grow to that direction altogether. Why has Latin America been a laboratory for green and inclusive growth? That's difficult to tell. I'm not sure on how to explain that process, but it is true that there has been a combination of enough diversity of governments that have realized different ways of trying to tackle this process, and very rapid degradation rates in certain dimensions, and basically a generation that has taken conscious very rapidly compared to other regions. So when I sit down and with counterparts in South Asia or East Asia, that level of consciousness across not only policymakers but also in terms of the research community and in terms of the private sector is not at the same level. That would be part of my hypothesis altogether. Private sector is very true, Cynthia. I think that what we are beginning to see is that many companies are beginning to see these dimensions of clean and efficiency in their production systems as a very important part of their competitiveness altogether. And then the resilience dimension is beginning to be a very important part of risk management framework. So when Coca-Cola starts saying, look, water is, and the resilience, our ability to handle water risk is an important part of, as a company, what we see to the future, you begin to see that actually similar frameworks are beginning to be incorporated not only as a part of the usual corporate and social responsibility, but very much part of the core competitiveness of companies moving forward. And all these ideas of recycling and reducing and becoming more efficient in their production system is not necessarily only just because it looks good, but it becomes part of the core competitiveness of the company, and we're beginning to see that. And in terms of mining companies, look, you also begin to see a differentiation between some of the more global companies that begin to realize that there are different constituencies watching over them, not only at the national and global level, compared to some of the smaller actors altogether. But then again, that process of integration at the global level means that those differentiations become a little bit blurred from what we are beginning to see. But lots of things to be done in that direction, that process.
Sure.
Okay. I will basically address just a couple of questions because the other were properly addressed by Ede. You know, Costa Rica vis-a-vis the other countries, yes, it's a matter of a scale, definitely, but the process is the same. Let me put it in this way. We tend to believe that progress in our societies were promoted by technology. I believe it's not technology rather than institutions. those countries who really progress are the ones who have transparency, accountability, ease of doing business, competitive, free press, private property, independence within powers, civil control of political control of society. I mean, those are the things that makes a country progress, not necessarily technology. Yes, Costa Rica is smaller, and probably scale is in favor of us, but Costa Rica has been very consistent for many, many years. I mean, Costa Rica in the turn of the 19th century was poorer than Haiti. Today is the third probably country in Latin America in human development standards. We abolished the army, we consistently invest in healthcare and education, and we did it our way. I think that, my personal view is we're wasting a lot of resources in defense and arming ourselves. That's not very wise for our region. I've never seen an army defending peace. And now there's a strong democratic process in our region, and that is a major asset. I think if we can work out improving governance and improving efficiency in our institutions, we may be able to do substantive advances. In those big failed nations, the state level is the best bet I can see. And I see Mexico and Brazil, two countries where there's a very clear political decentralization process towards the state level. And I see a lot of very successful things there. And at the state level, I see those two countries really stepping up and turning things in a positive way. Regarding indigenous communities, there's a lot of very interesting and positive things. Conservation International has worked for 25 years as a key partner of indigenous communities in many regions of Latin America. Best examples are probably the Kayapó in Mato Grosso, Brazil, and Cuchumatanes in Guatemala, with the Quecoldi in Panama, in Chiapas with indigenous communities. I mean, there's a lot that has been done by not only Conservation International, but many other organizations. Some of them human-driven, others nature conservation-driven. But remember, those who work on nature conservation, they work on nature because their core focus is human well-being. And those are, forest dwellers people are natural partners there. I think that the biggest challenge in some countries is the lack of trust within, central government and indigenous communities. And there are very positive examples like Sociobosque in Ecuador, where they have this payment for environmental services with a high angle on social elements. And I think that is a wonderful experience that the government of Ecuador has been implementing. And I think that there's a lot that can be done there, but on a more close, trustful relationships. And yes, Latin America is a very rich laboratory. The problem is not the laboratory, it's the scientists. We got 10 groups of scientists using the same equipment, the same building, shifting every hour, all trying to resolve different problems without coordinating, complementing, sharing the same budget, reporting to the same boss, and fighting each other for the equipment and the space. So the problem is not the laboratory or the scientists.
Well, just a couple of points, as I think my colleagues have covered these very well. Going back to your youth question, though, it strikes me that you see it in many countries in Latin America now. There is a renewed focus on the importance of education. And they understand that they are not going to make their way as competitive countries in the world by being low labor cost producers. They have to move higher up the value chain, and they have to have educated populations. And as most of them are talking about, people that are educated in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Now, we'll see how this goes. But to the extent there are greater budgets for education and more focus on the quality, not just the quantity of education, I think it's very important, and people like the World Bank and others can help in this, to make sure that these kind of green growth, if you will, values and issues are included in the curriculum. So the next generation understands all this stuff and doesn't have to be taught it by others. So that would be my comment on the education point. Why has Latin America been kind of an interesting laboratory for this? Well, I have a couple of thoughts, and maybe they're a little heretical. I think that Latin America if you talk about, and I'm uncomfortable with this terminology, but for the sake of argument, let's use it for areas of the world that are developing as opposed to developed. Latin America is the area that is most influenced, I would submit, by what we call Western, another terrible word, which means Western European and U.S. and Canada thinking and ideas and values and things. Not 100%, but so the influence of these ideas are stronger in Latin America in a general sense, perhaps, than in other areas of the world. This plays into a system where in the last 20 years or so, these countries, as Carlos Manuel was just talking about, are essentially open polities. They're not perfect by any means, but they're not dictatorships. There is freedom of the press. There are exchange of ideas. There are nonprofit organizations. There are civic society. And these ideas percolate and circulate around. So the combination of these two things, with a fairly strong civic culture, political diversity, openness to ideas that come from outside, particularly from U.S. and Europe, all have made it a place where some of these ideas have been, seeds have been planted, and then they've developed in their own unique Latin American way. And these are, by and large, not all, but a great number of these countries are at least middle-income countries, if not higher. And so they have the wherewithal to have some scientists that are doing some work. Now, maybe they're fighting among themselves, but they have indigenous capabilities that can work on some of these things. I think all of those contribute to that kind of development. And just one more thing about mining. We always hear about the mining projects that stimulate negative reaction. But if you look at a place like Peru, there are hundreds of mining projects there. And you hear about 4 or 5 where these big demonstrations. And there are demonstrations on other issues, too, that have nothing to do with mining. They have to do with distribution of water between Arequipa and Cusco and things like that. But there are other mining projects that are quite successful. Now, are they successful only because people haven't got ticked off enough to protest against them? Or are they successful because they're doing things that address in anticipating the issues that might arise in the future? That requires case-by-case analysis. But I think we should be a little bit careful not to generalize too dramatically in this area.
Well, I'd like to thank our 3 presenters, especially Ede, the principal author of this report and the coordinator of it, for really adding to our understanding and helping to set the agenda for the future on these issues going into this international conference, which is very important. Thank you for your attention, your good questions. On behalf of the Latin American Program, the Brazil Institute, and if I may, Marcela speak also on behalf of the World Bank. Thank you all for joining us for this afternoon.